The espresso machine was still hissing when the woman leaned across the mahogany desk and whispered the words that changed everything. Iyana stood completely still in her polyester waitress uniform, her fingers gripping the edge of a silver serving tray, her breath marking the heavy, expensive silence of the 50th floor executive suite, with the patient indifference of a girl who had spent years learning how to be invisible. Suite 500 of the Vornelle Tower was quiet in the way billionaire offices are quiet at 6 p.m. Not peaceful exactly, more like the world holding its breath before a strike. The floor-to-ceiling glass showed a slice of the city skyline, orange and bruised and completely unbothered by the cruelty happening inside. The woman, who called herself Iyana's superior, stood at the edge of the shadows. Caldris Vornelle was 38 years old, blonde, dressed in a sharp charcoal blazer she wore like armor. Her hair was pulled back in a professional bun so tight, it seemed to pull the skin of her face into a permanent mask of coldness. She had the posture of a woman who had spent her life stepping on others to see the view. Her face in the moody light carried the particular expression of a predator who thinks the cage is locked. She leaned forward close to Iyana's ear. Her voice dropped to something that was barely a sound at all, a hiss intended to break a spirit. "You're just a lowly maid, Iyana," she whispered. "And when I'm finished dismantling your father's network tomorrow, you won't even have this floor to scrub. You'll be back in the gutter where your kind belongs." Caldris straightened up, smoothed the front of her expensive blazer, and looked at the waitress's motionless face with an expression that was not anger, and was not pity, but something far colder. She picked up her crystal glass, unaware that for just a half-second Iyana's irises were bleeding into a molten predatory gold. The flash was there and then gone, swallowed back into a dark brown gaze of forced submission. Iyana blinked. She did not flinch. She did not lower her head. She simply nodded once and turned away, the silver tray steady in her hand. She moved with the calculated grace of a wolf pretending to be a sheep, leaving Caldris alone in her arrogance. And Caldris was completely unaware of the man standing behind the tinted glass partition, Ryujin Kaelor. He stood in the shadows, his hand pressed flat against the glass, his eyes fixed on his daughter with a terrifying stillness. He did not move. He did not intervene. His expression was that of a man who was counting down the seconds, giving the world one last moment of peace before he let his daughter burn it all to the ground. Iyana's commute home was a study in intentional erasure. She traded the high-rise glass of the Vornelle Tower for the flickering fluorescent hum of the subway, fading into the sea of tired commuters until she reached her apartment, a small clinical space on the edge of the city. There were no photographs on the walls, no evidence of the Kaelor name, no silk hangings from Seoul, and certainly no traces of the Veilborn lineage. To live in the world as a ghost, one had to leave no footprints. She sat on her narrow bed and checked her phone. One missed call. When she dialed back, the voice on the other end was like gravel over silk, deep, powerful, and thick with a restraint that matched her own. "You are safe?" Ryujin asked. His voice didn't carry the warmth of a father, but the heavy protection of a sovereign. "I am invisible," she replied softly. "Good. The promise remains, Iyana. For your mother's sake. Let the wolf sleep, and the world will leave you be." The memory of that promise always tasted like ash. After her mother's funeral, as the embers of the pyre died down, Iyana had looked at her father with eyes that wouldn't stop glowing gold. She had been ready to hunt, but Ryujin had knelt before her, his hands like iron on her shoulders. "The world fears what it cannot control," he had told her. "Hide the fire, or they will spend their lives trying to extinguish you." She had believed in that promise for years. She had built her life around the safety of being a nobody. But as she returned to the tower the next morning, the uniform felt less like a shield and more like a shroud. She was moving through the executive corridor, a tray of untouched water carafes in her hands, when the silence was broken by the sharp, impatient click of heels. Caldris was walking with a junior associate, her voice carrying that specific pitch of arrogance used by those who believe their surroundings are empty. "The Kaelor logistics contracts," Caldris said, her tone light, almost bored. "The forged signatures are already in the system. By the time the old man realizes his supply chain is hemorrhaging, I'll have enough leverage to force a total buyout. It's a clean kill. He's powerful, sure, but he's playing by old world rules." They walked right past Iyana. To them, she was just a fixture of the hallway, as significant as a coat rack or a potted plant. Caldris didn't even pause her sentence as she brushed past, her silk sleeve catching on Iyana's tray. Iyana stood perfectly still, her gaze lowered to the carpet, listening as the first edge of the sabotage was laid bare. She was a maid. She was furniture. And she was the last person in the world they should have let listen. Caldris Vornelle lived in a world of architecture and math. To her, people were not individuals. They were simply structural supports or obstacles. She had risen to the top of the Vornelle Tower by mapping every hierarchy like a blueprint, and finding the exact stress point where a single cold strike could cause a collapse. She had never needed to raise her voice or use physical force. She simply understood that most people were driven by fear, greed, or the desperate need to belong. By manipulating those three levers, she had built a kingdom of glass. Her cruelty toward Iyana wasn't born of a personal grudge. In fact, Caldris barely registered the waitress as a sentient being. To Caldris, Iyana was a shadow in a polyester vest, as replaceable as the light bulbs in the hallway. This was the most dangerous kind of malice, the kind that stems from total indifference. Caldris believed that because Iyana was a maid, she was incapable of thought, observation, or memory. It was a calculation based on a status hierarchy Caldris had never questioned. But today, Caldris's focus was on a much larger blueprint. She was moving against the Kaelor logistics network, a massive, silent empire that sat directly in the path of her next acquisition. She didn't hate Ryujin Kaelor. She simply saw his business as a bridge she needed to cross, and she intended to burn it once she reached the other side. She had spent months coordinating with rogue auditors and disloyal clerks, weaving a web of forged documents that would strip the Kaelor family of their legal protections in a single stroke. She sat at her desk, the city skyline glittering behind her like a crown. She picked up her fountain pen, the nib hovering over the first set of forged signatures. She believed she had accounted for every variable. She believed she knew every player on the board. She had no idea that the furniture in the hallway was currently memorizing every word of her plan. She had not calculated that the girl she called a nobody was the only person capable of tearing her kingdom down. If you stop halfway through this story, you will spend your dreams wondering what happens at the final revelation. So stay back, relax, and watch until the very end to see the true power of the Veilborn Queen. If you are enjoying this journey of revenge and hidden royalty, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Twisted Feral TV for more exciting stories like this. I would also love to know where you are joining us from today. Indicate your country in the comment section below. With a sharp, decisive flick of her wrist, Caldris signed the first document, the ink drying like a death warrant. She leaned back, a cold smile touching her lips, completely unaware that she had just signed her own destruction. The gold in Iyana's eyes was not a gift. It was a heavy, ancient inheritance that simmered just beneath the surface of her skin like molten lead. The Veilborn Queens were a lineage of shadows and teeth, a bloodline of werewolves so pure and so powerful that they had been hunted into the realm of myth. Her mother had been the last to wear the crown openly, a woman of ethereal grace who could command a room with a whisper and level a city with a snarl. She had taught Iyana that the veil was not just a metaphor, it was a survival mechanism. To be Veilborn was to carry a fire that could incinerate the very world you were trying to live in. Iyana stood in the darkness of her kitchen, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the counter. She could feel the pressure behind her eyes, the familiar, agonizing heat of the wolf trying to claw its way through her human restraint. For years, she had practiced the specific, clinical discipline of suppression, breathing through the heartbeat, cooling the blood, locking the predatory instincts behind a wall of silence. She knew exactly what would happen if that gold surfaced in the light of the Vornelle Tower. It wouldn't just be a career ended, it would be a bloodbath. She reached for her phone, her movements stiff and controlled. When Ryujin picked up, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. She spoke in a low, steady voice, relaying the details of Caldris's conversation, the forged signatures, and the systematic dismantling of the Kaelor supply lines. She told him that the enemy wasn't just at the gates. She was already inside the vault holding the pen. Her father was quiet for a long time. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, filled with the unspoken weight of a man who had spent decades protecting a daughter who was more dangerous than he was. He wasn't thinking about the money or the logistics. He was thinking about the cost of the silence they had both agreed to. "How long do you want to keep the promise, Iyana?" he asked finally. His voice was a low rumble, carrying the faint metallic edge of the wolf that lived within him too. Iyana looked at her reflection in the darkened window. For a split second, the gold flared bright and terrifying, before she forced it back into the brown. "A little longer," she whispered. "All right," Ryujin replied. The line went dead. Neither of them believed it. The promise was a fraying rope, and they both knew that the weight of the bloodline was finally becoming too heavy for the veil to hold. Ryujin Kaelor stood in the muted light of his private observation suite, a space defined by reinforced glass and the crushing weight of a legacy he had built from blood and iron. To the outside world, he was a ghost in a tailored suit, a man whose legitimate shipping conglomerates and silent tech acquisitions formed a canopy over a far darker network of protection and discipline. He was the architect of an empire that did not sleep, yet his mind was often anchored to a past that felt more real than the glittering city below. Every time he looked at his hands, he saw the faint shimmering echo of the woman he had loved, Iyana's mother. Her death had left a hole in the world that no amount of power could fill, leaving him with the grief that remained unperformed. A cold, quiet constant that he wore beneath his ribs like a concealed blade. His restraint was not a lack of will, it was a tactical choice. He had the resources to erase Caldris Vornelle from the social and financial map of the city by sunset. He could have turned her glass tower into a hollow shell with a single phone call to his black market specialists or his high court fixers. But he chose to stay his hand, not out of mercy, but because his daughter was in the room. He had watched Iyana fold herself into the shape of a servant, moving through the hallways of her enemy with a discipline that both filled him with pride and broke his heart. He understood the promise they had made, to keep the wolf asleep, but he also knew that a storm was coming that no veil could cover. He watched the monitors, his hand pressed flat against the glass, as if he could feel the vibrations of the tower miles away. He was not just a father. He was a king in waiting, observing a pretender play with fire. He had watched Caldris's arrogance grow, seen her mistake Iyana's silence for emptiness, and he had waited. He was still watching when the first silent alarm triggered on his encrypted tablet. The notification was brief. A coordinated strike had begun against a community center in the lower district, one of the small vital threads in the tapestry of his protection. Caldris's people had officially moved from strategy to assault. Ryujin did not flinch. He did not call for his guards or reach for a weapon. He simply looked at the blinking red icon with the clinical, detached expression of a man updating a clock. The time for the promise was running out, and the gears of a much larger machine had finally begun to turn. Caldris Vornelle had always been efficient at removing obstacles, but her mistake lay in her inability to distinguish between a business asset and a human heart. To her, the St. Jude Community Center was merely a line item on a topographical map of the district she intended to rezone. It was an old brick building that housed a soup kitchen, a youth sanctuary, and the only hope for 100 families who lived in the shadows of the Vornelle skyscrapers. Caldris didn't shutter the center out of spite. She did it because the land was worth more as a parking structure for her new tech hub. She signed the eviction notice with the same clinical indifference she used to order a latte. Iyana stood in the plush, silent corridor of the executive floor, clutching a stack of morning memos. Her phone sat heavy in her pocket, vibrating with frantic messages from the center's director, elderly Mrs. Gable, who had no idea that the anonymous donor, who kept their lights on, was currently standing 20 feet away from the woman who had just signed their destruction. These were people who had nothing to do with Ryujin's Mafia ties or the ancient politics of the Veilborn bloodline. They were innocent, and Caldris was crushing them simply because she didn't bother to look down. The air in the hallway seemed to thicken, turning hot and metallic. Iyana stared at the frosted glass of Caldris's office door, hearing the faint, triumphant laughter of the woman inside. For years, Iyana had absorbed every personal insult, every shove, and every lowly made comment with the stillness of a mountain. She could endure the erasure of her own dignity. But watching Caldris reach out and casually destroy the lives of those who couldn't fight back was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for a lifetime. Iyana felt the restraint develop its first real jagged crack. It wasn't a snap. It was a slow, agonizing separation of the human from the wolf. Her pulse hammered against her eardrums like a war drum, and the scent of the office, the expensive perfume, the ozone of the printers, the stale coffee, became sharp enough to make her teeth ache. Her fingers tightened around the memos until the paper crumpled into dust. Her eyes remained brown, but the effort to keep them that way was physical torture. It felt like holding back a landslide with her bare hands. She stood there, a silent fixture in a service uniform, while her soul began to howl. Caldris Vornelle thought she was clearing a path for her future. She had no idea that she had just stepped over the one line that Iyana Azythra would never allow her to cross. The maid was still standing in the hall, but the queen was finally, dangerously, awake. Iyana did not move with the frantic energy of the desperate. She moved with the silent, lethal precision of a predator who had finally stopped pretending to be prey. She shifted through the executive offices during the late-night shifts, her service uniform acting as a cloak of invisibility that allowed her to bypass the security guards who barely looked at her face. She began to document every inconsistency, every forged signature, and every shell company Caldris had used to bleed her father's empire. With the patience she had inherited from Ryujin and the heightened senses of her bloodline, she gathered the digital and physical proof of the betrayal, positioning the pieces of a trap that Caldris would never see coming. She was no longer just a waitress recording coffee orders. She was a strategist mapping out a battlefield. When the final piece of evidence clicked into place, she stepped into a stairwell and dialed her father. This time there was no hesitation in her voice. She didn't ask for his guidance or his permission. She spoke with the cold authority of the Veilborn Queen she was becoming, detailing exactly how and when she would dismantle Caldris Vornelle. Ryujin remained silent as he listened to his daughter describe the surgical destruction she had planned. The air on the other end of the line felt heavy with the pride of a man seeing his legacy fully realized. "I'll be there," he said finally, his voice a low, protective rumble. "You don't need to be," Iyana replied, her eyes fixed on the city lights below. "I have this under control." "I know," Ryujin said softly. He came anyway. An hour later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb of the Vornelle Tower. Ryujin Kaelor stepped out, his presence commanding the space around him without a single word. He walked into the lobby, signing in with a deliberate slowness that made the desk security tremble. He took the private elevator to the executive floor, the doors sliding open to reveal a world of glass and steel that was about to shatter. He did not go to Iyana. He did not interfere with her movement. Instead, he took his position behind the tinted glass wall of the upper floor, a silent, dark silhouette against the city lights. He stood there, hand pressed flat against the cool surface, watching as Iyana moved through the corridor below. He was present, a shadow of absolute authority, letting her lead the dance of retribution she had spent a lifetime preparing for. The trap was set, the witness was in place, and the time for silence was officially over. The summons came at 4 in the afternoon, the hour when the sun hit the Vornelle Tower at such an angle that the glass became a blinding golden wall. Caldris was seated behind her desk, silhouetted against the light like a god in a charcoal blazer. She didn't look up when Iyana entered. She simply pointed a manicured finger at a small, intentional spill on the side table. "Clean it," Caldris said, her voice dry and bored. "And then stand there. I have a list of things you failed to do this week that we need to address." Caldris began her familiar script, a rhythmic, condescending lecture on the invisibility of service and the high cost of mediocrity. She spoke about the Kaelor contracts as if they were already hers, mocking the old-world incompetence of a man who couldn't see his own foundation rotting. She called Iyana a lowly maid 3 times in 2 minutes, using the words like a physical weight to keep the girl's head down. Iyana let her finish. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, absorbing the venom until the air in the room grew heavy and still. Then, without a word, she reached into the hidden pocket of her uniform and pulled out a slim black folder. She stepped forward and set it on the polished mahogany desk, directly over the documents Caldris had been signing. "What is this?" Caldris asked, her lip curling in a sneer. "The end of your architecture," Iyana said. Her voice was quiet, devoid of anger or performance. It was simply a statement of fact. Inside that folder is the digital trail for the shell companies you used to bypass the Kaelor audits. There are recorded statements from the clerks you bribed and the original contracts you thought you'd shredded. Within 24 hours, the board will have these. Within 48, the authorities will have you. Caldris stared at the folder for a heartbeat, and then she began to laugh. It was a sharp, jagged sound that filled the room with the arrogance of the untouchable. "You? A maid? You think a few papers change the fact that you are nothing? You're threatening me from the bottom of the food chain, Iyana. Know your place." Iyana didn't blink. She leaned forward, placing her hands flat on the desk, and for the first time in years she let go. The restraint she had carried since her mother's death. The promise, the veil, the silence shattered. When she looked up, her eyes were no longer brown. They were fully, completely, and unmistakably gold. They glowed with an ancient, predatory heat that seemed to hum in the very air of the office. It wasn't a flash or a trick of the light. It was the unfiltered gaze of the Veilborn Queen, ancient and lethal. Caldris's laugh died in her throat. She tried to speak, but her breath hitched as the primal part of her brain, the part that understood when a predator had finally entered the room, screamed for her to run. The lowly maid was gone. In her place stood something that moved with the weight of empires, and for the first time in her life, Caldris Vornelle found herself at the bottom of a hierarchy she couldn't calculate her way out of. The collapse of Caldris Vornelle's world did not begin with an explosion, but with the quiet, rhythmic sound of notifications. As the molten gold in Iyana's eyes held Caldris paralyzed, the digital traps Iyana had spent weeks meticulously setting began to spring. Across the city, in high-rise boardrooms and encrypted servers, the architecture of Caldris's deception was systematically stripped bare. The forged contracts she had signed with such casual arrogance were flagged by internal security. The sabotage partnerships she had severed were restored by a series of untraceable, high-level overrides that bore the unmistakable thumbprint of the Kaelor network. Caldris watched, her face draining of color, as her monitors flickered with the frantic messages of her co-conspirators. The people she had moved against, the community leaders, the small business owners, and the loyal Kaelor associates, were suddenly receiving the documentation that named her as their predator. The hierarchy she had built, a tower of glass held together by the belief that she was the only one who could see the whole map, was shattering in real time. She had spent her life identifying who could be humiliated safely, but she had failed to realize that the woman she treated as part of the office decor was the very keystone holding her ceiling aloft. "This is impossible," Caldris hissed, her voice trembling as she finally found the strength to look away from Iyana's glowing gaze. "You're a maid. You don't have the access. You don't have the reach. You only saw the uniform," Iyana replied, her voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You never looked at the person wearing it. That was your only calculation that mattered, and you got it wrong." Caldris did not go quietly. As the security team, men she thought were on her payroll but who now stood with the stony, redirected loyalty of Ryujin's influence, approached the door, she began to scream. She threw a crystal carafe against the wall, the glass shattering with a sound that mimicked the fall of her career. She clawed at the desk, demanding to see the board, claiming she was the victim of a corporate coup. But the weight of the evidence Iyana had gathered was absolute. The silence of the floor was deafening. Every employee she had once bullied now watched from the hallways as the woman who had defined herself by her power was led away, stripped of every title she had ever stolen. She was a ghost before she even reached the elevator, her frantic protests echoing off the glass walls until the doors slid shut, cutting her off from the world she thought she owned. The architecture was gone, and the furniture was the only thing left standing in the ruins. The silence that followed Caldris's removal was not empty. It was heavy with the sudden, shifting gravity of a world being reset. The executive floor, once a theater of staged perfection and quiet terror, felt hollowed out, its glass walls reflecting a city that no longer belonged to the woman who had built it. Iyana stood alone at the center of the office, her hands resting on the desk that had been her altar of humiliation for years. She did not feel a rush of triumph, but rather a profound, cooling stillness. The pressure in her chest, the years of holding back a landslide, had finally leveled out into a vast open horizon. A subtle change in the air, a displacement of shadow, made her look toward the glass partition. Ryujin Kaelor stepped from behind the tinted wall, moving with the unhurried, rhythmic grace of a man who had never needed to rush to claim what was his. He did not come to announce his victory, or to take credit for the digital ambush that had just concluded. He simply crossed the floor to stand beside her, his presence a dark, familiar pillar in the fading afternoon light. They did not speak. Theirs was a relationship built on the shared weight of secrets, and the understanding of things that words only served to diminish. Ryujin looked at her, his expression unreadable to anyone else, but to Iyana, it was an invitation to finally stop running. The service uniform was still on her back, its polyester fabric a jarring contrast to the absolute authority she now radiated. The gold remained in her eyes, not as a flash of anger or a surge of heat, but as a permanent molten fire. It was no longer hidden, no longer suppressed. It was simply her, as much a part of her face as the curve of her jaw or the line of her brow. The veil had been lifted, and it was never coming back down. Iyana looked out at the skyline, the orange glow of the Los Angeles sunset catching the amber depths of her gaze. She did not know yet what she would do next. She did not know if she would take her place in the high-rise boardrooms or retreat back into the shadows of her father's empire. Those were questions for a tomorrow that felt distant and irrelevant. In this moment, she knew what she was. She knew the strength of the bloodline she carried and the depth of the legacy she had protected. That was enough. The story did not end with a declaration or a grand speech to the remaining employees who watched them from the hall. It ended with the two of them standing at the edge of the world they had broken and rebuilt. Two wolves in the center of a glass forest, watching the first star appear in a sky that was finally completely. My incredible audience, thank you for staying with Iyana and Ryujin until the very end of this journey. Your support and presence made this unfolding of justice possible. If you were moved by this transformation, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Twist of Feral TV so you never miss a new legend. Drop a comment below to let me know which part of the reveal was your favorite. Until next time, keep your eyes open. The most powerful people are often the ones the world chooses not to see.